Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome to First Parish, Unitarian Universalists of Arlington.
We choose.
We choose.
We choose to be
A liberal religious community.
Welcoming.
Welcoming to all.
We encourage each other
on our spiritual journeys.
Support one another
through the changes in our lives.
And challenge the excesses
and injustices of our time.
Called to love.
To love.
To love.
And upheld by joy.
We live our faith.
Whether you placed a stone of celebration or concern, may you be accompanied this week. I invite you to take a breath, to quiet your body. Put your feet on the floor. Take a breath. This is a prayer of delight. It is upheld by and upholds joy. Spirit of life and love, some days this prayer feels very far away and out of reach. This prayer refuses to go away. It is tenacious and persistent. This prayer demands an invitation. In fact, sometimes it just shows up. Holy One, forgive us when we overlook it. There are so many worthy things pulling at our attention. So many things we are holding. Anniversaries of losses, acute and sometimes painful reminders of loved ones past, sudden and unexpected diagnoses and transitions to end-of-life care, students begging for peace and being met with military force, tens of thousands of lives lost, and hostages still not home. A war spreading more hate and fear in a world that needs a lot less of that. Joy can seem small in comparison. At times, we are blanketed by despair. And yet, this prayer puts in overtime, really puts in the work. It does not give up, even when it's hard to find delight. And yet, the fragrant flower that snags at our senses, and we slow down to smell it more deeply. A child knee-deep in the dirt, befriending the worms. Look, look, it wiggles. The friend that calls out of the blue and wants nothing more than to hear your voice. I am here, this prayer whispers. I don't erase the pain. I don't diminish or deny it. But I am here too. I am joy. I am delight. I am here too. As this prayer makes itself known in our breath, in our inhales and exhales, let us settle in to 2 minutes of shared silence.
Good morning. That's always nice to hear. I'm Joanne Poole, member of the Social Justice Committee, and before I introduce our guest, I just want to give a quick shout out to 2 people who have served and worked with Social Justice Committee this year on what we call our worship task group to identify speakers for the Living Our Faith service, which occurred last October, and today's service for the Shinn Service. And that's Amy Anderson and Danny Dakota. Thank you both. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Michael Curry this morning. Dr. Curry is currently the president and CEO of the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers, which serves and represents 52 health centers, serving 1 million patients, more than that, in over 300 practices in the area. He previously served as the deputy CEO and general counsel for the League. He served on the healthcare transition teams for the former Massachusetts Governor, Deval Patrick, and former Boston Mayor, Marty Walsh, and he was involved in the passage of Massachusetts health reform and the Affordable Care Act. Dr. Curry is the past president of the Boston branch of the NAACP and has a long and ongoing commitment of service with NAACP at the city, state, and national level. Many of us listen to GBH Public Radio, and we often hear Dr. Curry on the Jim Brody and Marjorie Egan program. We were just talking about that. Dr. Curry earned a doctorate of jurisprudence from the New England School of Law. On a more local and Arlington level, just a few years ago, some of you may remember, that he moderated the restorative justice conversation seeking to build trust between the Arlington Police Department and the wider community, for which we are deeply grateful. He plans to stay after the service this morning to participate in the Reverberations discussion right here in the meeting room. Michael Curry, a very, very warm welcome to First Parish Meeting House.
Morning. It's good. I call and response. You immediately respond. It is an honor and a privilege to be here at First Parish. I get a chance with the work that I do to speak all over the country on a wide range of issues, health equity, racial justice, and I always enter a conversation thinking, in this moment we're in, what is the thing we're supposed to talk about? And I woke up this morning, of course, I had talked to the committee about the work that I do and the remarks that I make this morning, and then as I was driving here, I wiped all of the stuff I was going to say and decided to do something else. And I think what was on my spirit when I was en route here this morning was the fact that this is the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer. 60th anniversary. So for folks who know history and appreciate that history, 60 years ago, folks across the country, particularly in northern states, college students, activists, were really thinking about committing themselves to travel south to challenge segregation, to drive into Mississippi and register people to vote, or challenge their segregation systems within Mississippi, to teach young people literacy and civics. That was the movement of that campaign, because part of what they were feeling across the country was they could go into urban areas, and although they were met with resistance, there was something different about rural areas, deep southern areas like Mississippi, because it could result in death, because there was a stronger resistance to progress in places like Philadelphia, Mississippi. So I woke up this morning as I've been reading and thinking about that time, and I was remembering Shinn, Goodman, and Cheney, 3 civil rights workers who answered that call and decided to go south. They were actually investigating a church burning when they went south into Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I think for folks who know that history, they were murdered. And it took years to get justice for their murders. So I always ask myself when I think about the work that I do, that I'm, for the most part, not dealing with death threats. I don't have to worry about when I travel into cities and towns across this country to speak on issues. I don't necessarily have to worry about my safety. But if we could, as I always use the term, quantum leap back to the 1960s and 1964, what would it take for you to pack up right now after service today, knowing that you are going to travel south and challenge segregation and you may not come home? I want you to think about that for a minute, because we don't often, and we think about being woke and about challenging systems and dealing with the inequities of society today. We don't have the fear of losing our lives like so many others did. So I woke up this morning with that on my spirit, that Shinn, Goodman, and Cheney would want us thinking about their sacrifice and what they were actually fighting for. James Reeb would want you thinking about his service, his sacrifice, and why he answered Dr. King's call to go to Selma. So the work that I do now, and the work that I think many of you are engaged in, is this modern day struggle for equity, for social justice. This notion, and I teach a New England School of Law class, I teach a Suffolk University class, and I always start off every class I teach, and I overwhelm my students day 1, week 1, week 2, with disparities, with inequities. I literally spend a whole class telling them about wealth inequality, who's unbanked, unhoused, who's homeless, who's dying of almost every disease I could name at a higher rate, who's mass incarcerated, who's more likely to be shot, not only by another citizen, but by a police officer. I could spend 2-3 classes just on data, on overwhelming them with statistics, because I want them to understand that they've been weathered to it. So for those who don't know the term weathering was a term coined by Dr. Geronimus in 1990 when she was at the University of Michigan. And she was looking at women's fertility, and particularly the high rates of death and adverse outcomes in Black women's pregnancy. 1990, I didn't say 2024, because the numbers are still bad. They're still worse for Black women in their pregnancy. In 1990, the predominant notion was that Black women were having adverse outcomes because they were having babies as teens, so of course they would have bad pregnancies, or they would die, or their babies would die in pregnancy. That was the common belief during that period of time. You're quantum leaping, right? You're in 1990 now. So she decided to do research on it and got Black women in her study and found out that actually the healthiest mothers and the healthiest babies were the teen babies and teen mothers and their babies. But they actually were healthier, and that the sicker they became, the more likely they became to experience an adverse outcome was in their 20s and 30s and 40s, contrary to white women. And she coined the phrase weathering, that persistent subjugation to poverty, racism, trauma, violence, go down the list, will impact your health and impact your baby's health. So she asked the question, are we weathered? When I was introduced to the term, I was at a session like this, and I was sitting in the front row, and a group of researchers came in and they said, okay, we asked Black women to rate their kids' asthma from 1 to 10. I had never heard the term weathering before. And they said, we asked the Black mothers, many of those Black mothers rated their kids' asthma 3, 4s, and 5s, And then we asked the researchers to doctors to evaluate those same kids, and they were 8, 9s, and 10s. That was weathering. I grew up in Roxbury. I was the child born to a mother who came here for the warmth of other sons. We lived in a housing project. We were steered into Lenox Street housing projects and away from other housing developments. Read The Color of Law. We lived in a neighborhood that had high rates of high incidence of environmental issues. We had rats and roaches in our apartments. Almost every kid in our neighborhood had asthma. So I was on the Alupent 3, 4, or 5 times a day. I was in the emergency room at Boston City Hospital once a month, once a quarter, whether it was me, my sister, or my mother. I could walk outside my home and see diabetes everywhere I turned. Heart disease, cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, name the disease, lupus. So their researchers, the argument was, you've gotten so used to the Alupent flow vent, you've gotten so used to sitting in the emergency room, you can't go to gym, you gotta sit out of work, or you can't go to work, that you're weathered to being sick. So when I think about 1964 and Freedom Summer, and I think about where we are today, I ask the question, what are we weathered to? Because weathering is an interesting thing. That means you wake up in the morning, you go about your business, you do work, you may come to church, but the reality is if you understood the data, if you understood that people were living shorter lives and sicker lives, and that they were sitting in prison, and that they were homeless or unbanked, that they weren't building wealth, that they were internalizing racism, might you be as bold as Sherner and Goodman and Cheney were, as James Reeb was, to do something now. That's why I think I overwhelm them with statistics when I do those presentations, because I think my goal of doing it is to unweather them. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first African-American female physician, she said, they seem to forget there's a cause for every ailment, and it may be in their power to remove it. She said that she was a physician in 1864. I think she said that shortly after she became a physician in Boston during Reconstruction. They seem to forget there's a cause for every ailment, and it may be in their power to remove it. So as I get asked to speak at organizations across the country on the fact that women are surviving breast cancer at higher rates, but not black women, that we have a maternal health crisis in this country that is disparately impacting black women and their babies. That I can walk into almost any prison in this country, any jail in this country, and no matter what small portion of that community is, somewhere to 60% of that prison will be black and brown. Unless you believe we're just more violent, and we do more drugs, and we deserve to be in prison. So I think the unweathering is beyond just healthcare. It's all the conditions in society we become weathered to. They just become part of your daily news, part of what society just has these inequities. But I think my charge for you, and I think the charge I put into my life, is I will spend the rest of my life trying to unweather us. Unweather us. Because I know, and I say this around healthcare, I want you to think about this, is there are attacks on affirmative action, attacks on DEI now, and I jokingly say I'm glad so many people are woke now, and others are waking up, but some of us are insomniacs, right? I know there's some insomniacs in here today. That means it didn't take George Floyd's murder. It didn't take a pandemic to realize who's closer to the disease. Some of us wake up or don't sleep, but spend every moment thinking about these inequities. And so I know that's heavy. That's a heavy burden to give people, to have to think about inequities every day as you try to navigate your own trials and tribulations, your challenges in your life. But I always go back to these activists, these leaders. We tend to lift up Dr. King, but there were so many others who risked their lives for what was right. And though no one is likely to murder you for doing what was right, what is right, where's your sense of urgency? Where's your sense of commitment to a movement, to a struggle, when there is injustices right outside this door? Now, we talk about white supremacy, and I get to, I jokingly say that 20 years ago, some of these topics that I bring up, you would have not been invited to the meeting. But now we sort of open the door to these conversations, and I tell people, if you think that's normal, something's wrong with you. If you think it's normal that you could walk in any medical school right now in this country and you won't see diversity in that room, that's not normal. I say all the time, there's a little black girl right now in Roxbury meant to save your life. She's meant to find a cure for cancer. Right? I want you to tug at your own notions of equality, your own notions of white supremacy, and say, that little girl, if talent is equally dispersed, it's not just in Arlington, it's in Chelsea, it's in Lynn, it's in Lawrence, it's white, it's black, it's a man, it's a woman, right? It's every zip code, that talent exists in every community, but yet that little girl that's meant to save your life, you will never know her because she doesn't have the academic rigor, because she has a teacher that doesn't believe that she could be in that STEM course, or that she should be in that AP course, or that that potential is in her, or she's internalized racism. Well, that's what white people do. I don't know any black doctors. I don't know any black lawyers. Or she lives in a community overrun by violence, and therefore she can't study, and she doesn't have the nutrition and the food to be able to concentrate in class. I just spoke at their academy yesterday about that. How do you expect kids to show up and perform in a classroom when they don't come to class with the same circumstances? Right? But we expect them all to show up and be top-notch students. But that little girl is meant to save your life. Why do I tell that story? So I can push you on the diversity, equity, inclusion thing because it's the right thing to do, because it's the responsible thing to do. But if we understand that talent, we rely on everyone's talent to make this a better society, we've relegated people to poverty. We've denied people access to show up as their best selves, to produce those things that we need them to produce. I say all that this morning because right now, I don't feel a sense of urgency in this country. I think we walk through society and we accept that most of these things are just the way it is. I don't feel that way. I walk through Roxbury, where I grew up, and I walk around and I see so many people sick and serving in positions that are not tapping their full potential. My mother was a housekeeper for most of my life for a wealthy family in Chestnut Hill, but a brilliant woman who cleaned up and took care of other people's babies my entire life. But what might she have been if she had been given that opportunity to get an education? If she didn't have to move to the north for the warmth of other suns, and she could have stayed in Alabama and got an education and got a job and gone on to get an advanced degree and to do amazing things. That's when I think about my mother, I think about that as I look at her, as I think about the 1960s, the warmth of other suns, people migrating out of the South, 6 million people leaving because the South didn't offer those opportunities, and moved to cities that didn't offer them either. They just offered more. So I leave you this morning with some thoughts about, if not now, then when, and if not you, then who? I leave you, as you think about June 1964, to think about Sherner, Goodman, and Cheney. What real sacrifice in service looks like. What real selflessness looks like when you show up every day to make a difference, no matter what the outcome will be. I have the opportunity to be invited to work with governors and mayors, invited to the White House to provide a presentation on healthcare issues. And the thing that I say to them, that I say to you right now, is I don't feel that sense of urgency in our society. So I'm asking you for it. I'm asking you for it. I think about, maybe it was 15 years ago. I'm thinking about time now. 15 years, many years ago, we had an anniversary for the March on Washington. And the Unitarian Universalist Church in Roxbury called me and said, Michael, we want to send people to the anniversary of March on Washington. Would you help us? And we're going to bring our churches from across Massachusetts. I don't know if anybody in the room was on those buses. But we coordinated those buses that went down to DC. And one of the things that I was so impressed by when I think about your faith, when I think about the Unitarian Universalist movement, is that you care and you're willing to have the critical conversations. You're willing to be in the mix to figure out why these injustices exist and what your individual and collective role is to do something about it. Now, I have a worldview, and my worldview is that all of these things I'm telling you about, I also see them in other countries. I also see these injustices all over the world, so we can, of course, fight our battles here in Massachusetts, and we can fight those battles nationally, but they are global too. As we talked about vaccines, and I was asked by the United Kingdom to be part of a health equity conversation, and I remember saying, you know, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But I said a threat to public health anywhere is a threat to public health everywhere. That the reality is some people haven't even gotten their first shot of COVID-19 vaccine. So we sit here comfortably knowing that we've really fought against this pandemic, but there are other countries right now that are still impacted by that disease in a way that we don't even see them. Or the war-torn and violent countries right now where people are worried about their lives. Turn your televisions on, open your papers. You know, my heart bleeds for those families in those kibbutz in Israel. And my heart bleeds for those families and those babies and those families that we see in Palestine. But we become weathered to that because we go on, right? What is our role and what our responsibility to do something about senseless death, violence, whether we see it in our neighborhood or whether we see it on television? Some community hundreds of thousands of miles away. I don't know what the answer is, right? But I do know that if I have any message for you today is I don't feel the sense of urgency. So there are people dying right now that we can actually save their lives. We can create better opportunity for them. If I can, just to wind it up, because I only have a little bit of time with you this morning, is to say that nothing can be solved that can't be faced. Nothing can be solved that can't be faced. And we have an opportunity to face some really critical issues in our society around discrimination, around inclusion, around social justice. So I don't know where you fit in. I don't know what your particular passion is, if it's healthcare, if it's housing, if it's education, if it's criminal justice system. But what I ask of you this morning as we have this conversation is I need you to show up. I need you to show up with a sense of urgency to address the issues that I see on a daily basis. I'm going to make one last comparison, and it may not be the appropriate one. I'm going to make a comparison I make when I talk about these issues. None of this is easy. There's a movie that I used to love when I was a younger person called Sixth Sense. Anyone remember that movie? And the classic line from that movie was, "I see dead people." And if you remember the theme, the little boy could see dead people because they wanted to say bye to their loved one, or they wanted their murder solved, or they left a treasure chest of stuff for their family, but no one knows where it is. And the child was being asked by those people that were dead to help them get to that answer. And I use that example when I say I see dead people because I know he didn't want to see them. That seeing them came with being crazy. Seeing them meant that people would treat you as if you were crazy. So I understand in society, we don't want to see these things because people don't invite you to the meeting. We don't want to see these things because then you may get fired when you raise your hand in the room. We don't want to see these things because then society typecasts you as the militant or the rabble-rouser. So we don't want to see them. So the choice becomes you have to make the decision and the sacrifice that seeing them will have a consequence. I see dead people. So I always use that analogy because I find myself in this moment when I sat in a room 3 years ago and we were deciding which one of you got a vaccine and when. And Governor Baker had appointed me to that task force, and is Cindy Friedman here, Senator Friedman? I make sure she's not in the room because I'm going to reference her when I say this. When I sat in that room, I felt thankful to be in a room with some other insomniacs. Because when they were deciding, they said, well, you know what, let's give J&J to Roxbury, Lynn, Lawrence, Lowell, because they don't trust the vaccine, they won't come back for a second shot. Give Moderna, Pfizer, Arlington, Newton, Wellesley. Somebody in the room raised their hand and said, but that's not equity. I know they all save lives, but that's not equity. We were deciding who got a vaccine. We said, okay, first responders. Of course, we need the folks on the front line to get those vaccines, to get the vaccines that'll keep them on the front lines to save lives. And then, okay, we'll do the next group is 75 plus, because we know nursing homes, as you saw facilities across this country, we're losing our seniors to COVID-19. And then we started prioritizing who would get it. And I think Cindy Friedman, myself, and others raised their hand, but that doesn't feel like equity. You just showed us data that showed that the folks who are dying disparately at higher rates of the disease are black and brown, and they have comorbidities. And they're 30, and they're 40, and they're 50. So how do we make sure that they get the vaccine sooner so we can save lives? But you got to be the skunk in the party willing to raise your hand and ask the question. And I can tell you I was very nervous to do it because I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a scientist. These were brilliant people on the call. These were people who are published, who are world-renowned for their research, and yet I got to raise my hand and challenge them on equity. So this is the critical work that we all do, is that if you're taking this charge that I'm giving you this morning, it means that you may be the awkward person to raise it. You may be criticized. You may be not invited. You may be fired. You may be disruptive at the Thanksgiving Day table or the Christmas party because you're challenging people to do what's right, to show up. And I'll tell you this, which I think is the beautiful thing as I wind down, I'll say this: it takes time for truth to catch up to history. I think we're seeing that as we now are unraveling all of American history, and you're realizing that we never told the truth. We never told the truth. I go into schools all the time and I say, okay, Thayer Academy, I was a guest speaker for the entire student body. I said, wait a minute, slavery from the arrival of slaves in 1619 to arguably 1865, although we know there was systems that kept people in servitude after official slavery ended in 1865. Juneteenth, we now celebrate. I said, how much time did you spend in your classrooms on slavery? From an institution that existed from 1619 to 1865, how much study did you give to the ownership of human beings for generations? And I say my exam this morning is name me 5 sheroes and heroes from slavery. Just 5. Think about it. Generations. You should be able to name me 5 men or women who violently or non-violently fought to free themselves. Give me liberty or give me death. Can you? So I want you to ask the question, this truth, as people are attacking history, black history, which is American history, why would they do that? Because we're a dysfunctional family, and in this family we are a family of abuse, neglect, and other horrible things that have happened in our family, and all of a sudden someone says, just let's stop talking about that. Let's pretend that never existed. Don't bring that up at the dinner table. If you bring that up, I will disown you. You know what? I don't believe that ever happened. So we've gaslighted many people in this country that pretend that that history, that struggle never existed, and that the vestiges of that struggle don't exist today. I always ask people, why is it that little kid puts a gun in his hand and shoots into a crowd and doesn't care about the lives of those kids in that park? Now, you may be worried just about the fact that a child died in a park. I'm worried about the kid who put the gun in his hand and shot into the park. What trauma he or she might have experienced, what abuse they might have experienced, how they've internalized hatred. And I need to understand that. They seem to forget there's a cause for every ailment, and it may be in their power to remove it. They seem to forget there's a cause for every act of violence, and there may be a power in their power to address it. We don't seem to understand or appreciate the cause. So again, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? I feel extremely thankful for you. Because there aren't a lot of people who are calling for a conversation like this, who are willing to kind of think about on a Sunday what your role and what your responsibility is. I need you to be insomniacs. I need you not to go to sleep. America's going to sleep right now. Okay, enough with the George Floyd stuff. We've had enough of that. Let's get rid of all these DEI jobs. Let's turn the corner on all this racial just wokeness stuff. You're burdening your grandchildren when there's the next race riot, when there's the next Ferguson, when that racial tension exists in your household or in your neighborhood. They will bear that burden that you could have taken care of now. That's what we are charged with. That's what Sherner, Goodman, and Cheney would be telling us now. That's what James Reed would be telling us now. What is our responsibility to finish their work? Thank you.